A scattering of small Norwegian fishing boats pushed out into the darkness in the autumn of 1940, their engines muffled, their lights extinguished, their crews praying the sea would hide them better than any weapon could. They were not yet part of anything organized or named. They were simply men fleeing an occupied homeland, navigating west toward a remote chain of islands they had only heard about in stories. But in their wake lay the beginnings of a lifeline that would soon reshape the resistance movement across an entire country. The collapse of Norway earlier that year had been swift and bruising. German forces had come on 9 April 1940, striking simultaneously at ports, airfields, and communication lines. Attempts at defense, though spirited, could not match the momentum and coordination of the invasion. By June, the government had fled to London, and the occupation was complete. But defeat did not quiet everyone. Some Norwegians refused to accept the new order, slipping into mountains, forests, and eventually out across the sea in whatever vessels remained unguarded. Many found their way to Britain, forming a growing exiled community that carried with it a determination to continue the fight in whatever form was possible. For those left behind, the coastline became both a barrier and a possibility. The North Sea was brutally unpredictable, a place where winter storms could swallow a vessel whole. Yet it also offered the only safe direction away from patrols, checkpoints, and the tightening grip of German control. In the months after the occupation, a handful of small boats began making the crossing to the Shetland Islands. These early expeditions were improvised and desperate. Boats leaked, engines failed, crews navigated by instinct and memory, praying fog or nightfall would hide them from aircraft and patrol craft. Some boats made it, others simply vanished into the Stormactton Chaveet, the Sea of Storms, earning its name, with cold precision. Those who arrived in Shetland discovered a world far different from the mainland of Britain. The islands were remote and wind-scoured, closer to Bergen than to London, and shaped by centuries of fishing culture. For the exiled Norwegians who reached them, this isolation was a reminder of home but also an opportunity, a place where secrecy was easier, where small harbours and tight-knit communities could shelter those who needed a quiet base to reorganize. It was not long before British intelligence officers noticed the pattern of arrivals and began to consider its possibilities. Within the Special Operations Executive, the SOE discussions intensified through mid-1941. Norway, with its long coastline and strategic location along German supply routes, was an attractive target for sabotage, intelligence gathering, and political support operations. But the country was hard to reach, and standard naval assets were too prominent for secret insertions. What SOE needed was a shuttle system, discreet and renewable, operated by men who understood the coastlines intimately and could move through them without drawing attention. The early refugee boats, unsafe as they were, had shown that the route was possible. What was missing was structure, planning, and the right leadership. That leadership emerged through two men: Lieutenant David Howarth of the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve and the charismatic actor-turned-soldier Martin Linge. Both had seen enough of the early crossings to recognize the potential of a formalized maritime route. Howarth brought logistical discipline and naval insight. Linge brought the connections and trust of the exiled Norwegian community. Together, they envisioned a continuous shuttle, a bus service, across the sea using ordinary fishing boats as cover. But the idea required far more than enthusiasm. Boats had to be sourced, crews assembled, and permissions secured from London. The Norwegians insisted on one crucial point: the vessels had to remain fishing boats. These wooden craft, between 30 and 70 feet long, were unnoticeable along the Norwegian coast. Their silhouettes, their engines, even the way they moved through water, were familiar to local eyes and harder for German patrols to distinguish. British officers were skeptical. The boats were slow, fragile, and vulnerable to storms, but the Norwegians argued that disguise was their best defense, and Howarth, having seen the early successes, agreed. By October 1941, The plan had been approved. A tiny base was established at Lunner on the east side of Shetland, a place chosen precisely because of its isolation. The winding roads discouraged unnecessary travel, the harbour was sheltered, and the local population was scattered and accustomed to keeping their own guide. There, the first crews gathered, men with deep knowledge of fjords and tides, men who had worked the sea since childhood. They were fishermen, sailors, mechanics, ordinary tradesmen who now stepped silently into the world of stealthy warfare. From Lunner, the first official missions were prepared, boats were checked, engines refitted, and essential supplies loaded in ways that would not raise suspicion if inspected from afar. Radios, Sten guns, money, and agents were packed carefully beneath tarpaulins and fish crates. The crews prepared for landings in narrow inlets and remote villages where Milorg contacts waited for news from abroad. No one understated the risk. The North Sea, now turning toward winter, had already consumed more boats than German forces had. But the crews accepted the danger with a kind of quiet resolve that would define the Shetland Bus in the years ahead. As the first missions departed into the gathering darkness, the men of Lunner understood they were beginning something fragile and untested. This was no formal convoy, no naval squadron armed with artillery or radar. It was a handful of civilian boats, heading toward an occupied coastline under the cold weight of night. Success depended entirely on seamanship, weather, and luck, three forces that rarely aligned for long. Winter was coming, and in the North Sea, that meant the true test of the Shetland Bus was about to begin. The first official missions of late 1941 began cautiously, edging out from Lunner's quiet harbour and into waters that neither charts nor radios could fully tame. The goal was simple in concept, yet risky in practice. Deliver agents and supplies to the occupied Norwegian coast, gather intelligence where possible, and return with refugees or messages that would help shape the resistance's next steps. But each voyage revealed how fragile this plan would be when confronted with the realities of the North Sea. At the outset, the crews relied heavily on their own experience. The British officers in Shetland could advise on tides and forecast storms, but the Norwegians had grown up navigating the coastline from Kristiansand to Helgeland, reading changes in wind and water long before instruments confirmed them. They knew where German patrols liked to linger, which fjords offered hidden approaches, and which harbours were now too closely watched to risk. Still, even this knowledge could not predict everything. Weather windows closed abruptly. Fog swallowed entire vessels without warning. What appeared to be a safe route one night could become a death trap the next. On these early missions, the pressure from SOE headquarters in London was steady and growing. The war in Europe was intensifying, and Norway, stretched along the German supply routes to the Arctic, was strategically significant. London wanted agents on the ground, radios in safe hands, and sabotage teams prepared for larger operations to come. Yet the officers in Shetland, and especially the Norwegian captains, warned that winter crossings were an entirely different battle. Storms from late November onward could strike with sudden and violent force. A wooden fishing boat in such conditions was more vulnerable to waves than to enemy fire. Despite the tension between urgency and caution, missions continued. Some were remarkably successful. Boats landed in remote inlets where Milorg groups waited with shuttered lanterns and coded signals. They offloaded Sten guns and explosives wrapped in waterproof coverings, then took aboard families who had been living under the threat of arrest or reprisals. In other cases, boats approached the coast only to find German patrols unexpectedly thick in the area. The crews would wait offshore for hours, engines silent, each minute increasing the risk of detection or worsening weather. Navigation became one of the defining challenges of the Shetland Bus's first year. These boats travelled in blackout conditions, their lights extinguished to avoid the attention of aircraft or coastal batteries. Crews relied on dead reckoning, calculating position by estimated speed and direction, supplemented only by moonlight or the faint loom of the coastline. When fog settled in, as it often did in winter, a boat could lose the horizon entirely. Some captains trusted the color of the water or the feel of the wind to guide them. Others dropped lead lines to test depth, hoping the fjords would reveal themselves before the rocks did. German patrols added another layer of danger. Aircraft from the coast occasionally swept out over the sea on reconnaissance runs, forcing the boats to throttle down and drift, praying their silhouettes blended with the waves. Patrol boats roamed near key inlets, and rumors circulated of informants along the coast. The crews developed strict procedures for landings. Specific light signals flashed at prearranged angles, silent approaches along the least visible side of an inlet, and coded confirmations exchanged quickly with resistance contacts on shore. These measures were continually refined after each mission, especially when conditions nearly exposed a landing. Trust between the SOE officers and the Norwegian captains evolved through trial and tension. The British staff required mission tempo to increase, but the captains, who had seen boats crushed or capsized in storms, called for restraint. Some argued that even a single winter evening could undo months of planning if the weather turned unexpectedly. Yet the captains also shared a fierce determination. Many had family still in Norway. Many had fled under fire. Each successful crossing strengthened their sense of purpose, and each near disaster reinforced their insistence that seamanship, not schedule, must dictate the pace. Still, losses came. A few early boats simply never returned, taken by storms that descended too quickly for any evasive maneuver. Others were damaged so severely that they barely limped back to Shetland, their cabins smashed, rigging torn, engines struggling. Word of these losses spread quietly among the crews. Yet volunteers continued to step forward. By the end of 1942, one truth was clear. The greatest enemy of the Shetland Bus was not always the German patrols, but the North Sea itself. Each failure pushed the crews to refine their methods. They adjusted their routes to take advantage of currents, revised departure times to avoid predictable patrol windows, and improved the way supplies were packed to keep them dry and secure even in heavy seas. The early missions taught them that success required humility before the ocean and absolute discipline in every step of the operation. Through these hard lessons, a rhythm began to form, tentative, fragile, but unmistakably present. Yet, the deeper winter of 1942-43 was approaching, and the seas were about to shift into their most violent phase. The experience gained in the first year would be tested ruthlessly, and the cost would reshape the entire operation. As the captains prepared their boats for another season of crossings, a question hung over every departure. How long could a lifeline built on courage and wooden hulls survive the winter storms gathering beyond the horizon? Winter tightened its grip on the North Sea in late 1942, bringing with it a level of violence that even veteran fishermen struggled to describe. Those who had worked these waters for decades spoke of waves that rose like cliffs and winds that changed direction without warning, as if the entire ocean were shifting beneath them. For the Shetland Bus crews, this was the season they had feared, the one that would test not only their vessels, but the very idea of a continuous lifeline between Shetland and occupied Norway. The missions did not pause. Supplies were still needed, couriers still waiting, families still desperate to escape. But the moment a boat cleared the shelter of a Thai harbour, the crews felt the change. Storms formed faster, tracking across the sea with a ferocity unmatched by the previous year. The boats pitched violently, dropping into troughs that seemed impossibly deep. More than one captain later recalled that the waves sounded like thunder long before they struck the hull. As the weeks passed, the toll became undeniable. Several vessels were destroyed or disabled, not by German fire, but by the overwhelming force of wind and water. One boat returned to Shetland with its deck half torn away. Another arrived with the wheelhouse smashed beyond repair, the crew exhausted and bruised from hours spent fighting the sea. Others were not so fortunate. Boats vanished into storms without delivering a single distress signal, leaving behind only uncertainty. Reports at the time noted the severity of the winter, and later meteorological records confirmed that the 1942-43 season was among the most violent in years. German forces were not blind to the unusual activity along the coast. Radar installations and air patrols had expanded through 1942, and their presence added a new level of danger for every voyage. Aircraft occasionally appeared over the waves, even in bad weather, forcing the Norwegian captains to cut their engines and drift until the threat passed. Patrol boats moved along the fjords with greater regularity, their searchlights sweeping across dark waters where any silhouette might betray an undercover landing. Yet, despite these new risks, morale among the Shetland crews remained unexpectedly resilient. Many were fishermen before the war, and hardship at sea was not unfamiliar. What weighed on them was not fear of the Germans but the relentless uncertainty of the weather. They knew the sea could turn fatal in minutes, and they understood that even their skill could only carry them so far. Every departure in winter felt like a negotiation with forces that did not bargain, extended beyond the cruise. At SOE headquarters in London, a debate emerged over whether the Shetland Bus should continue operating through such conditions. Some argued that the operation had become unsustainable, its losses outweighing its successes. Others believed the Lifeline was too valuable to abandon. Norway's resistance movement relied on the flow of agents and equipment, and intelligence gathered from these missions informed British assessments of German activity in the region. Without the Shetland Bus, the country's underground networks risked isolation. In Shetland itself, David Howarth and his team faced the immediate consequences of each loss. Every time a boat failed to return, they waited through long nights for news that did not come. Howarth received increasing pressure from London to raise the mission tempo, while the Norwegian captains insisted that the sea, not the schedule, must dictate their movements. The tension was palpable, yet both sides understood the stakes. Neither wished to abandon the men, women, and agents who were counting on the crossings. Under these conditions, the Shetland Bus began to reassess its equipment. The wooden fishing boats had served well for disguise, but their limitations in winter were becoming impossible to ignore. They were slow, unable to outrun patrol craft, and structurally vulnerable to heavy seas. Captains found themselves pushing their vessels beyond what any builder had intended, relying on skill and experience to keep the hulls intact. As the losses mounted, discussions grew urgent about finding sturdier, faster boats, ones with the power to handle winter gales and the speed to escape detection. Still, the missions continued. Landings were made in remote fjords, where Milorg contacts endured their own hardships. Families were extracted quietly, often under the threat of imminent arrest. Agents delivered radios and instructions for sabotage teams preparing for future operations. Each mission that succeeded strengthened the resistance, but each failure left a shadow that lingered over Luna and the exiled Norwegian community. By the early months of 1943, the cumulative pressure of these storms and losses had pushed the operation to a critical point. Several in London questioned its long-term viability. Some proposed pausing the winter missions entirely. Others argued that such a pause would leave Milorg isolated for crucial months. The debate carried an urgency that reflected how essential the Shetland Bus had become to Allied strategy in Norway. Behind closed doors, officers weighed the risks of continuing against the risks of stopping, knowing that neither choice came without consequences. In the end, the conclusion reached was stark but clear. The operation must not end, but it must change. The idea of replacing the old wooden vessels began to take hold, and efforts were made to secure something more robust. Rumors spread among the crews of new boats, being prepared somewhere far away, boats designed not for disguise but for speed, strength, and resilience. For now, though, they still had to survive the winter. The storms had not eased. Missions were still being ordered, and each time a boat left Luna's quiet harbour, the men aboard knew they were stepping into waters that could swallow them without leaving a trace. But just beyond the horizon, unseen by the crews fighting the waves. A decision had already been made, one that would soon transform the Shetland Bus and alter the course of its struggle against sea and enemy alike. The rumours became reality in the summer of 1943, arriving not with ceremony, but with the low hum of engines that sounded unmistakably different from any vessel in the Shetland harbour. 3 sleek silhouettes appeared on the water, longer, sharper, and unmistakably faster than the wooden fishing boats that had carried the operation through its darkest winter. Their arrival marked a turning point. For the first time, the Shetland Bus possessed vessels built not for deception, but for endurance and speed. They were American submarine chasers, steel-hulled and powered by robust engines that could push them across the North Sea at a pace no fishing boat could match. Their names Hesse, Vigra, and Sotra were Norwegian, chosen to honour the men who would crew them. To the captains who had fought storms in wooden hulls, these new boats felt almost unreal. Their decks were sturdy, their cabins warm, their engines strong enough to cut across the waves rather than be swallowed by them. But their greatest advantage was speed. What had taken a fishing boat 2 or 3 nights, a submarine chaser could do in far less time, reducing exposure to storms and patrols alike. Yet the crews understood immediately that these vessels came with their own demands. They were complex machines, equipped with engines and systems unfamiliar to fishermen who had worked by instinct and experience. Training began at once. Norwegian crews learned to operate new engines, manage higher speeds in treacherous waters, and maintain equipment that required careful attention rather than the simple mechanical familiarity of a fishing boat. The shift from quiet disguise to high-speed evasion required a new mindset as well. Once, the boats had slipped along the coast, pretending to be part of the daily life of occupied Norway. Now, their best defense was to move fast enough that German patrols would have no time to react. The arrival of the chasers also prompted a change of base. Luna, with all its familiarity and isolation, no longer had the facilities needed to service the new vessels. The Shetland Bus moved to Scalloway, where improved workshops, deeper berths, and quicker access to open water offered advantages that the crews quickly came to appreciate. Though some mourned the quiet safety of Luna's harbour, Scalloway allowed the operation to prepare each mission more efficiently. And the townspeople offered the same discretion and support that had anchored the early years. As the submarine chasers settled into their new home, the tempo of operations shifted dramatically. The boats could now cross the sea in conditions that would have crippled their predecessors. With their reinforced hulls, they rode over swells that once threatened to break wooden decks. Even so, the North Sea remained unpredictable. A storm could still challenge the steel vessels. But the balance between the Shetland Bus and the sea had undeniably changed. The crews felt it each time they turned their bows eastward. They now travelled with a sense of strength rather than constant fragility. This new capability opened doors to operations previously considered too risky. Agents could be inserted deeper into Norway, delivered to fjords under greater surveillance, or to communities where resistance networks needed rapid reinforcement. Sabotage teams, especially those from Company Linge, now received heavier and more complex equipment, explosives, wireless sets, and supplies that had been difficult to transport in the cramped holds of fishing boats. The Norwegian resistance was expanding, and the Shetland Bus was now equipped to match its needs. With the increased capacity came increased expectations. London pressed for more missions. Field commanders sent more requests. Milorg cells, coordinating across valleys and coastlines, prepared for operations that required precise timing. Railway sabotage, weapons drops, and the formation of escape routes for those being hunted by German forces. The submarine chasers became the backbone of these efforts, carrying both the tools of resistance and the hope of those waiting onshore. But alongside the enthusiasm, a new tension grew. The larger and more powerful the vessels, the more visible they became to German radar and coastal observers. Disguise was no longer an option. Speed was now the primary defense. This meant tighter timing, darker departure windows, and stricter adherence to radio silence. Crews learned to drive the vessels at high speed through narrow approaches, trusting their charts and instincts as the land rose, with no single light to guide them. The change in the operation's nature did not erase the memory of the boats lost the previous winter. Every captain who stepped aboard a submarine chaser carried the weight of men who had not returned. The new vessels were an answer to loss, not a replacement for the courage that had defined the early years. Still, there was no denying the new confidence that spread through the operation. Missions long considered impossible now seemed within reach. By the end of 1943, the Shetland Bus was transformed. It no longer relied solely on disguise and luck. It now wielded speed, strength, and improved coordination with resistance networks deep inside Norway. The crews, seasoned by hardship and shaped by their education in the unforgiving North Sea, were ready to push the boundaries of what the operation could accomplish. Ahead lay the most active period in the Lifeline's history, a stretch of months when the submarine chasers would travel almost constantly, their engines humming through darkness, carrying agents, weapons, and families whose lives depended on every mile successfully crossed. Their missions would become bolder, their reach broader, and their impact on the course of Norway's resistance unmistakable. Yet even with new vessels and renewed momentum, the dangers had not disappeared. They had simply changed shape, and as the chasers prepared for their next series of missions, the crews sensed that the coming year would test them with challenges more complex than weather alone. By late 1943, the Shetland Bus moved with a momentum that had once seemed place sight impossible. The arrival of the submarine chasers had not only strengthened the operation's capabilities, but had reshaped its strategic purpose. What had begun as a fragile lifeline, one trip at a time, hoping the sea would allow another, was now a high-tempo clandestine network, feeding a growing resistance movement across Norway. Each mission carried more weight, more precision, and a new understanding that the tide of the war might finally be shifting. The crews felt the change most immediately in the frequency of departures. Where missions had once spaced themselves around rare weather breaks and the limitations of wooden boats, the chasers now allowed for a steady rhythm. Engines warmed in the darkened harbours of Scalloway several nights a week. Navigation plans grew more complex, charting deeper penetration into occupied waters. And the crews, hardened by years of storms, slipped into a relentless cycle of loading, departing, delivering, and returning, each journey another, stitch in a widening web of resistance. Kompani Linge, the Norwegian commando force trained under SOE, became central to this surge. Throughout 1943 and into 1944, the Shetland Bus inserted teams into critical regions, where railway lines fed German troop movements, where coastal installations supplied U-boat operations, and where intelligence networks needed secure links back to Britain. The submarine chasers ferried explosives hidden beneath fishing gear, radios packed in waterproof containers, and trained operators whose survival depended on reaching the right fjord at the right hour. Many of these teams launched sabotage actions that disrupted German logistics, just as the Eastern Front and the advancing Allies placed new pressures on Berlin. The Norwegian coast, however, was becoming increasingly dangerous. German countermeasures expanded in response to growing resistance activity. Batteries along key headlands received new equipment, radar sites multiplied, patrol patterns intensified. Searchlights probed the water more frequently, sweeping across inlets where a single misjudged movement could betray a landing. Informants, whether coerced or opportunistic, played their part as well, giving the occupiers clues about which villages were sympathetic to the underground. In response, the Shetland Bus crews refined their tactics. Landings were timed to moonless nights, when the darkness was thick enough to hide a vessel at close range. The chasers approached the coast at high speed, then cut engines to drift silently toward predetermined points known only to a handful of resistance members. Communication was limited to short, coded signals, brief flashes of light shielded by a fisherman's hand, a single, muffled knock from a waiting boat on shore, a lantern placed behind a rock at just the right height. Every sound was measured, every movement rehearsed. As the operation expanded, its cargo grew more varied. What had once been, primarily weapons and radios, now included money to support underground networks, tools for sabotage specialists, medical supplies for hidden clinics, and documents vital for intelligence coordination. In the cramped interior of a submarine chaser, the crews sometimes joked that they carried half of Norway in their holds, equipment for fighters, messages for organizers, and hope for families waiting in silence. The extraction missions were the most emotionally charged. Families who had lived under the threat of arrest, informants, or deportation waited in barns or forests until word came that the bus was near. Mothers carried children who had never seen Britain. Fathers looking over their shoulders for German patrols that might appear at any moment. When the chasers drifted into the fjords, the meetings were quick, whispered, and often marked by fear that the sea might claim them before safety did. Yet every successful extraction strengthened the resolve of those who stayed behind. To know that escape was possible, even faintly, was itself a form of resistance. All of this was happening under increasing German pressure. Patrol boats lingered where previously they had passed through. More aircraft crossed the coastline, even at night, forcing the submarine chasers to slow or change course. Resistance contacts, aware of rising danger, tightened their protocols and limited the number of people involved in each landing. Still, the lines held. Milorg's coordination with the Shetland Bus became a crucial element of the Norwegian struggle, and the constant flow of supplies helped resistance groups prepare for the possibility of open conflict as the war neared its turning point. By 1944, the Shetland Bus was no longer a desperate improvisation. It was a deliberate, finely tuned machine woven into both Allied strategy and Norwegian survival. The missions expanded not only in frequency but in ambition. Some operations delivered specialized teams, trained for targeted tasks, railway demolition, power supply disruption, and intelligence gathering on German troop concentrations. Others served as the backbone for escape networks that moved fugitives across treacherous terrain to secret pickup points. Every successful journey was a blow to the occupiers. Every return carried information that London relied upon details of coastal defences, troop movements, and German supply routes that fed directly into Allied planning. With the submarine chasers accelerating their operations, the Shetland Bus became one of the most reliable maritime links between Britain and any occupied territory in Europe. But even in this period of strength, the crews understood that time was working against them in more ways than one. German forces were tightening their grip along sections of the coast, improving their radar coverage, and reinforcing installations that had once seemed penetrable. Each mission required greater precision, greater silence, and greater luck. The year ahead would bring new challenges as the German occupation grew more anxious and more vigilant. The storm seasons would return, patrols would multiply, and the Shetland Bus, now operating at the highest tempo in its history, would face dangers that no steel hull or bright engine could fully dispel. The rhythms of the operation had changed, but its risks had not vanished. They had merely gathered on the horizon, waiting for their moment to close in. By the winter of 1944, the Shetland Bus crews sensed a shift in the air, one not defined by weather, but by the war's tightening trajectory. Germany was retreating across multiple fronts, yet in Norway, the occupation forces remained entrenched and alert. Their watchfulness sharpened even as their broader strategic position unraveled. This irony shaped every mission that winter. The closer liberation came, the more dangerous the five. Coastal approaches became. The submarine chasers pressed on. Their engines, once symbols of newfound strength, now carried crews into zones where German radar had improved, patrols had intensified, and batteries were more likely to fire first and question later. Approaching Norway required a different balance than before. Speed remained essential, but caution had grown equally important. The chasers sliced through dark seas, then slowed to a faint crawl as they neared the fjords, listening for the rumble of an engine or the metallic echo of a searchlight repositioning across the cliffs. Despite these threats, the missions deepened in urgency. Resistance networks were preparing for the final phase of the war, anticipating sabotage opportunities as German forces began focusing on withdrawal routes, supply hubs, and infrastructure vital to their occupation. The Shetland Bus delivered arms for these efforts, offloading crates of explosives and specialized equipment designed to disrupt communication lines, delay troop movements, and weaken German control ahead of any wider collapse. These missions required precision, unlike anything in the previous years. In some fjords, German units had established temporary listening posts, forcing landings to shift to new locations with little time for reconnaissance. Onshore contacts adapted quickly, moving under guard of darkness to redirect agents and equipment. The cooperation between Milorg and the Shetland Bus reached a level of seamlessness that had grown out of years of shared risk. Every signal, every interaction, every quiet flash of light had to be exact because mistakes carried consequences that no one needed. Extraction missions during this period carried a different tension than those of earlier years. As the war neared its end, reprisals in Norway became harsher. Some families fleeing through forests or over mountain paths arrived at pickup points exhausted from days of travel. Others carried messages vital to the Allied understanding of German defensive plans. The submarine chasers took them aboard quickly, sometimes only minutes ahead of patrols making their rounds. In one fjord, the crew cut their engines and drifted silently past a patrol boat whose searchlight swept the water mere seconds before they slipped behind a rocky outcrop. Incidents like this underscored how narrow the margin for error had become. Still, the flow continued. Agents preparing for liberation needed radios, batteries, and instructions for coordinated actions. Some operations required inserting specialists with detailed knowledge of infrastructure targeted for sabotage as the German withdrawal unfolded. The Shetland Bus became the conduit through which these final preparations were supplied, each mission timed to align with events unfolding across Europe. As 1945 approached, the German presence along the coast took on a particular character, one that mixed rigidity with desperation. Soldiers followed their patrol schedules with a severity that surprised some resistance groups, even as rumors circulated that the war's end was near. This made the Shetland Bus missions paradoxically both more predictable and more dangerous. Patrol patterns became rigid, almost mechanical, allowing the chasers to exploit the gaps. But mistakes by the German side, such as firing at shadows or changing searchlight angles without warning, forced the crews to remain constantly on alert. In February and March, storms returned, though not with the same ferocity as the devastating winter of 1942-43. Even so, heavy seas could still make a steel hull shudder. The chasers pushed through them, knowing that postponing missions could leave key resistance groups without the means to act at the decisive moment. The crews had learned to read the weather with near-instinctive skill, departing during narrow windows when the waves eased just enough to allow safe passage. By April, Norway was bracing for the inevitable. Intelligence flowing back through the Shetland Bus painted a picture of German units preparing fallback positions and planning for a controlled capitulation. Resistance groups positioned themselves for the moment when German authority would falter, ensuring that vital infrastructure would not be destroyed in retreat. For these final efforts, the bus delivered the last radios, the final bundles of explosives, and the critical instructions that linked scattered groups into a coherent national readiness. In early May, the news spread quickly across the fjords and mountains. Germany had capitulated. Norway was to be liberated on 8 May 1945. The Shetland Bus still made a few final runs in the days leading up to and immediately following the surrender, delivering agents who would participate in stabilizing efforts and extracting individuals who had remained in hiding until the last moment. These journeys carried a strange Atmosphere relief tempered by the knowledge that danger had not fully passed. Mines still drifted, patrols still moved until orders reached them, and the coastline remained unpredictable even as occupation ended. Then, slowly, the pace ceased. Engines cooled. Crews stepped onto the docks of Scalloway with the quiet recognition that their work, carried out in darkness for nearly 4 years, was drawing to a close. Some had crossed the sea dozens of times. Others had begun only recently. All carried memories of nights spent fighting waves taller than their vessels, of landings under cliffs where silence meant survival, and of faces both rescued and lost, etched permanently into their thoughts. The war had ended, but the men of the Shetland Bus were left wondering what came next for an operation that had lived entirely in the shadows. Their vessels were still seaworthy, their skills undiminished, and their purpose fulfilled. Yet the sea that had defined their courage now felt strangely empty without the missions that had shaped their recent years. Ahead lay the reckoning of what their sacrifices had built and what had been paid for that lifeline they had carried across the sea. When peace finally settled over Norway, the Shetland Bus stood at a strange crossroads celebrated for its achievements. Yet suddenly, without a mission, for nearly 4 years, its crews had lived in a rhythm shaped entirely by darkness, secrecy, and the unbroken horizon between Shetland and the fjords. Now, as occupation forces surrendered and the last German patrols laid down their arms, the men who had kept the lifeline alive stepped into a world that was trying to return to normal. But normality had a different meaning for those who had spent the war threading danger through storms and silence. The first days of liberation revealed just how deeply the Shetland Bus had influenced the resistance. Agents, who had been inserted months earlier, now surfaced openly, coordinating with emerging civilian authorities and assisting in the orderly transition of regions once tightly controlled. Radios delivered during the final missions buzzed with messages of surrender, acceptance, troop handovers, and the re-establishment of legitimate governance. Norwegian families reunited in coastal towns, some of them only alive because a Shetland Bus extraction had come in time. Yet even as these celebrations unfolded on shore, the crews in Scalloway knew their own chapter was nearing its end. Demobilization began quietly. The submarine chasers, Hesse, Vigra, and Sotra, were inspected, serviced, and made ready for peacetime roles, though their wartime purpose could never be replicated. Luna, the original base whose sheltered harbour had launched the earliest missions, became a place of reflection rather than departure. The move to Scalloway had transformed operations, but Luna's quiet inlets remained, the symbolic birthplace of the Lifeline. Now, both sites transitioned from secrecy to remembrance. The losses endured by the Shetland Bus emerged more clearly in peacetime. Archival figures recorded around 44 men who never returned, though accounts vary slightly due to incomplete wartime logs. Some boats were known to have been lost in storms, torn apart or dragged under by forces stronger than any seamanship could resist. Others disappeared without trace, their fates left to the sea. No memorial could capture the full weight of those absences. But communities in Shetland and Norway began creating their own ways to honour them. Plaques, gatherings, and stories passed between families who understood what these journeys had meant. For Norway, the legacy of the operation became inseparable from the broader narrative of resistance. Leif Larsen, already a legendary figure for completing more missions than any other skipper, emerged from the war as a national symbol of courage. His skill, endurance, and quiet resolve embodied the spirit that had driven the Shetland Bus. Lieutenant David Howarth, whose steady leadership had shaped the operation from its earliest days, documented its story after the war, ensuring that the world would understand the scale of what had been achieved with such limited means. But, beyond individual figures, the Shetland Bus left a more profound lesson: that improvisation, local knowledge, and human determination could carve a lifeline through one of the most dangerous maritime environments in the world. The operation had never possessed the resources of a navy, or the firepower of a fleet. Instead, it relied on ordinary fishing boats, then on a trio of steel chasers, and always on the skill of men who knew the sea intimately. In an era of massive armies and sweeping offensives, the Shetland Bus proved that small, unknown efforts could carry strategic weight far beyond their size. The dangers of the operation had not ended with the war's conclusion. Mines still floated in the North Sea, and coastal waters remained hazardous as demolition charges, unexploded ordnance, and abandoned equipment continued to surface. Some crews stayed in Shetland long enough to assist local authorities or to help reposition vessels that had played their part. But the movement that had once been defined by urgency and risk slowly dispersed. Some men returned to fishing. Others sought new paths shaped by wartime experience. A few remained in Britain, having built new lives during their exile. In 1946, the Shetland Bus was officially dissolved. The final paperwork, prepared in London and forwarded to Norwegian authorities, acknowledged a unit that had never resembled a traditional military organization, yet had delivered outcomes that reshaped the course of resistance. The closure was administrative, almost understated a contrast to the intensity of the work it had performed. Yet, for those who had lived it, the closure operation remained as vivid as any battle. Over time, memorials took shape. In Scalloway, a simple monument lists the names of the men lost at sea, a quiet testament to the cost of keeping a lifeline open. Museums in Shetland and across Norway preserve photographs, charts, and fragments of equipment, silent artifacts that hint at the cold nights and whispered landings that defined the operation. Visitors to these places often remark on the ordinariness of the objects: waterproofed radios, thick clothing, and fishing gear. Their simplicity underscores one of the enduring truths of the Shetland Bus, that extraordinary courage often hides behind unremarkable tools. The legacy of the operation extends beyond memorials. In studies of clandestine warfare, the Shetland Bus is frequently cited as an example of how logistics and local expertise can empower a resistance movement even under heavy occupation. Its impact is measured not just in supplies delivered or missions completed, but in the confidence it gave to those who knew they had not been abandoned. Every landing in a dark fjord, every extraction under threat, reinforced the idea that Norway's fight for freedom continued from the shadows, supported by men willing to cross one of the world's most unforgiving seas. As the years passed, the stories of the Shetland Bus were told and retold, some through documented histories, others through memories shared in homes in Shetland and along the Norwegian coast. With each retelling, the operation's significance deepened. It was not simply a tale of agents and boats. It was a story of endurance, of ingenuity, and of the ties between two communities, joined by hardship and resolve. And in the end, the true measure of the Shetland Bus lay not only in the missions completed, but in the simple, enduring fact that small vessels, guided by ordinary seamen, had kept a nation connected during its darkest years. The war had ended, but the memory of that quiet lifeline continued to move across the sea, carried onward by those who understood how much had depended on boats that once slipped into the night. If stories of quiet courage and forgotten lifelines move you, consider supporting this channel for more journeys into the hidden corners of World War II. Like, comment, and subscribe, and stay with us as we uncover the past, one story at a time.